Hello, welcome. My name is Neha Vasakha, and I'm the host of the podcast series The Feminist City. This is offered by Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, and in this series, we think about cities, our relationships with the city, and exclusions in the city.
When we wanted to talk about how the criminal justice system sort of does not really work in the context of women's safety and empowerment, I think we had a slightly different take and approach on it. But given a few recent events, I think it's worth commenting on them and sort of, revisiting our episode and taking a completely different approach to our discussion. And specifically, this is sort of prompted by actually one particular meme, if you could call it. And I saw that actually put all of this together very recently, and this is being recorded a few days after Disha Ravi was arrested by the Delhi police in Bangalore. And it follows close on the heels of in the last 12 to 14 months, we have heard of the instance of Nodeep Kaur, we've heard of Gulfisha Fatima, Natasha Narwal, and a few others, all women in their 20s and who are sort of protesting or being activists about issues that are not strictly quote unquote women's issues. And this to
Yeah.
me is a very new phenomenon. And when we think about, you know, women's place in public spaces and women's role in public spaces, this to me is kind of a new challenge that the criminal justice system seems to, or at least rather the criminal justice system seems to think is a challenge that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. I think, what you pointed out is true, Alok. There is a construction of the woman or the girl in criminal law that is somebody who needs protection, that is somebody who needs a paternalistic concern. Because I don't think we should forget that our sitting Chief Justice of India said, "Why are women and old people at the protests?" It's
Right.
as if, yeah, so it's almost as if that women do not have agency to be political, beings, to be equal in the same way the constitution allows everybody else to be, which is why I think when we then talk about, on one hand, you have these recent really alarming policy proposals, whether it's in the Madhya Pradesh or in Uttar Pradesh, where for the purpose of women's safety, now proposals such as, oh, women should go register at the nearest police station, or we will use surveillance to detect if a woman is in crisis, as if she cannot herself come or speak up for, if she is in crisis. So on one hand, you see this paternalistic protectionism, which is the state telling you, we know better than you, we will protect you. And on the other hand, you see all of these young women who are speaking up and who don't need protection, who are being targeted also by the state. So it's
It is. And I think when we talk about the criminal justice
yeah.
system or policing as such, as protecting women or seeing it as a solution to protecting women, we have to, I guess, necessarily question that. We have to say, is that even the right approach? And also unpack why it would be the completely the wrong approach, given how the police is structured and given how we've seen the police work in this country. And it's not just about adding a few women constables. Right? I mean, of course, the police force should be more gender balanced, but we're not just saying that if you add a few more women to the police, everything will be solved.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this also brings me to some of the research that I was doing in the Feminist Cities project, and I would encourage people to just go take a look at the report that we've recently released called "Making a Feminist City: A Legal and Policy Perspective." Because what I engaged there in the report is precisely about this very strange notion of how safety is understood in our country, and there are a lot of misconceptions around it, because usually protection from this unknown outside danger, this perception of risk in public space is so overwhelming that when women themselves feel scared of stepping out. There was actually a very poignant quote I recently came across, that at night in most large cities, all women are agoraphobic, which is what Esther D. Costa Mayor said,
Right.
which is essentially that we're all terrified of the open space when there's nobody at night, right? But that perception of risk doesn't come out of nowhere. It is constructed and built into the city. And I think it's really important for us to recognize and understand that. Secondly, the minute we understand this, we need to first understand what produces safety and why protectionism is not an answer. Because in the research that I've done, and as many, many, many feminist activists, researchers, geographers have pointed out, the most amount of violence women actually experience, women and girls actually experience, is inside the home.
Right.
The rates of domestic violence is extremely high, and we've actually seen that in COVID. We've seen that in COVID, the explosion of, where women were literally trying to leave their homes because they're experiencing violence at home. But when we talk about safety in the city, we don't think about the home, we think about public space. And criminal law also sort of enters the picture because of this stranger danger, right? Whether it's the construction of the other in the city, it's the migrant worker, it's the working class man, it's the Muslim man, the oh, these are the people that we have to protect our women from. And who are these women in question? Usually your young, able-bodied, upper caste Hindu women. So it's, yeah, I think these are the popular imaginations, I think, that pervade imagination or understanding of safety. And then this is what criminal law seems to, on the face of it, address.
And I think what you've highlighted has sort of it's something that we're going to unpack over the course of the remaining episode. And before our viewers wonder who this is Alok Prasanna Kumar. I am senior resident fellow and head of Vedi Karnataka, and I'm just joining Sneha on this podcast. Sneha, is, of course, who's the host and the producer of this podcast, to have this conversation, a very important conversation, I believe, on women's safety and why criminal law is not and procedure is not the necessary answer.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Alok, for joining me today. And yeah, so in this episode, this is what we'll do: just engage with why. I mean, the argument that I'm going to make, both which I made in the report as well as I'll make today, is why criminal law is not or should not be the sole site for feminist intervention or engagement.
Right.
But we need to shift away from criminal law when we are thinking about safety and move on to structural changes in society, move on to municipal laws,
Yeah.
move on to education, move on to social and economic justice, mechanisms,
Right.
in terms of what can law do, to change the nature of society,
Yeah.
as opposed to.
So anytime we talk about women's safety, and I think especially for most of the listeners of this podcast, will be, of course, young enough to remember the incidents post the Nirbhaya case, and where the response of the government was instantly to think of criminal law. And I think what was also, I mean, in hindsight, at the moment, we were all caught up in the discussion. In hindsight, I suppose what was also troubling was that many feminist movements in India, I mean, I don't think there is any one feminist movement in India, which is why perhaps it's best to use the term several feminist movements in India, said criminal law is the answer, right? And I think they were harking back to their own experiences in the 80s. For those of
Yeah.
you who are interested, the website 52.in has a very long read on the history of India's gender movement, how the infamous Mathura rape case and the Supreme Court's observations around it sparked this kind of movement, which sort of saw police and the criminal law as a site for sexual assault against women, as a site for compromising women's safety, and not so much as enhancing it. But even with that history, somehow, somewhere along the way, that river meandered and went in a different direction, so that the response after the horrific incident of December 2012 was that let's find a way to strengthen policing, let's find a way to strengthen criminal law, death penalty to rapists. And to me it was kind of or at least that was then the general thing. But in hindsight, and it took us, I suppose, a year or two to realize that maybe this wasn't the right option, and maybe what is called carceral feminism, if that's the right phrase I'm using,
Yeah.
isn't the kind of approach that favors women's safety but actively compromises others' safety.
Absolutely. I think, no, look, I could not agree more. I do think that it's about time we revisit the way in which we understand and think about which area of the law we need to engage for reform. But as you mentioned, another book that I would recommend to everyone is Radha Kumar's History of Doing, which sort of tracks women's movements in India from, in the recent, she sort of collates a really beautiful history of women's movements in India. And I think while I understand and disagree with this approach now, I also recognize that in 1975 or even just in the 70s and 80s, Dowry Prohibition Act didn't exist.
Right.
cruelty as a crime didn't exist.
Right.
So, like every year, tens and thousands of women were being burnt alive by their families over dowry, and police wouldn't even investigate it because it was a private matter. So, I recognize that at a time where police would not even consider these as murders
Mm.
or culpable homicides that they have to investigate, the site for criminal intervention probably would become that no, this is actually something that you have to investigate. Cruelty from the family has to be a crime. And I think that was important then, but I do realize that even post Nirbhaya's case, one of the criminal law changes that actually still hasn't come is the removal of the exemption of marital, on marital rape. The marital rape exemption in IPC still continues to persist, despite the fact that the JS Verma committee report recommended that it be removed. So there is still a very strong perception that what happens in the home should remain in the home, which you also see echoed by the government today, that what happens in the country should remain in the country. We have a paternalistic state that mimics the patriarchal family. So, which is why I think now, I think what Me Too for me did was that. I think Me Too, which was landmark and historic in so many ways across the world, but in particular, it was a scathing indictment of the failures of due process,
Right.
whether it is criminal law in the way that we think about the IPC or others, or it is just due process in sexual harassment law.
Yeah.
We also cannot forget that we are a country where a former Chief Justice was accused of sexual harassment, and the process adopted by the Supreme Court itself was riddled with so many procedural, I mean, I don't know what to call it. It was an injustice in the process that it was, done. So it was women telling the world that this process doesn't work for us.
Right.
So then the question is, who is it working for, and why do we still, make it
No, I think what
something
you said is
that's
very important because a friend shared on Facebook very recently this image of Satya Rani Chadha, who lost her daughter Kanchan to dowry, and she engaged in a sit-in on the steps of the Supreme Court with the papers of the case and a photo of her daughter demanding a change in criminal laws. And this was in the
yeah,
80s, if I'm not mistaken, 70s and 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And it's very interesting to see the trajectory of the change. I think what you
yeah,
say is very important. We have to understand the trajectory. We just can't go due process failed. Too bad. We have to say there was a time when it was seen that due process and criminal justice was an option and should be used for women's protection. But having seen how it has worked over the years, an entirely different generation of women are now saying it doesn't work. No, this was the wrong approach. Maybe we should try something else. But we can't fault those who asked for it for also asking for it because that was what they saw as they needed. So
yeah,
it's very interesting and to understand how views have changed and how people see these issues, we have to see the context also because and I think the very important point that you made about the prevention of that, also Section 498 capital A, right? It is one of those things which was supposed to
yeah,
address issues of cruelty, but it has now morphed into something entirely different. Not to say that it doesn't serve an important purpose; it serves a very important purpose. But ironically enough, it has become the site for criminal law reform where judges are laying down guidelines for arrest, judges are laying down rules for anticipatory bail, judges are saying things like bail, not jail, all because it is affecting the most privileged section of society, right? Because the Arkesh
absolutely.
Kumar
Yeah, yeah,
case, which
yeah,
people even mentioned recently in the context of Disha Ravi, was in the context of a 498A case. So in a very like these trajectories go in unexpected ways, but each generation of the women's
yeah,
movement, I think, sort of learns from the past. And I think one of the things that I personally witnessed in a lot of discussions about Me Too was this generational gap. One generation of women's actors, and again, not to draw any particular immediate judgments, to say no, guys, due process works, and another generation of the younger generation of women's activists says no, it does not, and both of them are partially true because when
yeah,
the earlier generation were agitating for this, they were dealing with a certain context where due process was aimed at them directly, and they wanted to turn it around. Right? It was
yeah,
actively ignored them, and they wanted to be part of it. But another generation has realized it doesn't work there. That they have the benefit of the experience
Yeah.
that the previous generation gave them to learn from. So
Yeah.
that trajectory of how criminal law and criminal justice interact with women's rights in spaces, I think we have to understand it's a complicated history, and it's about building on rather than sort of saying that only one approach is right or they're fundamentally opposed to it.
Absolutely. I think this is, I mean, thank you for pointing that out. I think it's really, I think it is important for us to keep those contextual realities in mind in the subjectivities that at different points of time, different groups of women were working with. And I mean, to quote Mackinnon, who incidentally was one of the first people to actually create a
Sorry, you mean Catherine McKinnon? Because I'm totally ignorant about a lot of feminist.
Catherine Mackinnon.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Catherine Mackinnon was incidentally one of the people who sort of provided or developed the legal basis for a claim in sexual harassment. And but she also says that law is a product of a male oriented view of the world, a male dominated state, and it systematically victimizes and discriminates against women. And she says that's because law treats women the way men see and treat women.
Right.
And that there is a male control over female sexuality that is sort of reenacted, and that the feminist standpoint then is to uncover and claim the experiences of women as valid, because what happens in these systems is an invalidation of women's experiences and women's realities. And her scathing like criticism of law is also that objectivity and neutrality are just a cover for male bias in the system.
Right.
And which I think is really important for us to keep in mind. And also I think the feminist movement has to also shift in understanding how feminism itself is developing. Is that I think when the Mathura case happened, or when we see Manvari Devi's case, which have we all these have been landmark cases that we read about. But I think we also need to be keep in mind that Mathura was an Adivasi girl, and Manvari Devi was from a lower caste background, and so we have to understand the dynamics of the relationships between the state and Adivasi people
Right.
and upper caste people with lower caste women. And women are not a category that can be, easily just, it's not the same experiences.
Right.
There are different things that are happening at, I think, which then also brings me to this question of how do then women from multiple marginalizations hope to get justice in a system that the most privileged women in the society cannot even access.
Right.
So there is a I think a differential access to justice that already exists.
Yes, and I think this was brought home to all of us very starkly in the context of the Hathras rape and murder,
Absolutely.
which took
Yeah.
place in UP, in western UP, in the district of Hathras. And even if you account for the 8 year gap between 7.5, 8 year gap between the Nirbhaya rape case and in Delhi and the Hathras rape case, you find that the social position of the victim here seems to have played a role in how even the state views their case, right?
Absolutely.
A lot of people tend to sort of distill it to purely electoral politics that
Yeah.
the votes of this community were important or that community were important. But I think the real way to understand was uh, not just not just the class element of it, right? Because the class element will hide will say that, well, his father worked as an airport baggage handler, and these were farm landed. I mean, what is the massive class difference between them? We have to also understand that the Nirbhaya's victim was of belonged to an upper caste, and the Hathras victim definitely belonged to Dalit family, and there
Absolutely.
were local aspects to this, which is in the sense that this was a Dalit family asserting its land rights, and
Yeah.
punishing the woman was seen as a way of punishing the family and therefore the caste.
Yeah.
Whereas the gaze, if you want, of the public in the Nirbhaya case was different because the perpetrators
Yeah.
generally belonged to a much lower class and caste than the victim,
Yeah.
and it was
Absolutely.
seen as a how dare you touch our women.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
in a way, we have to, and as you made the valid point, we have to understand that the state and the criminal justice system does not see all victims and all perpetrators
In the same way.
in the same way.
Absolutely.
All in the case of gender, right? There are
Yeah.
some male perpetrators who are like to get away with it, as opposed
Yeah.
to others. there are
Yeah.
certain certain female victims who are likely to be heard, right? And
Yeah.
I don't mean in the judicial sense, but I mean in the heard
Yeah.
by the system or by the society at large than
Yeah.
other victims. So when we right, and that's a very valid point that you sort of made. This comparison between the two highlights how even the criminal justice system makes this
Yeah.
difference.
Alok, just no, just let's not even go back to Nirbhaya. Priyanka Reddy case in
Yes.
Hyderabad.
Oh yes, yes, yes.
What happened in the Priyanka Reddy case?
Yes,
That was
within a year, right? Yeah.
no the encounter. It was an encounter killing of the accused
Yeah.
within, and the police were hailed as heroes,
Yeah.
and which is the stark contrast of
I mean,
yeah,
I wouldn't even call the Priyanka Reddy criminal justice because that is outright murder. But the only
yeah,
reason why I even reached perhaps for by cases, at least the criminal justice system wanted to show that it works. Here, the criminal justice system wasn't even interested in showing that it works.
yeah.
Or
It's also funny, yeah, because the criminal justice system tried to show that it worked by completely subverting every principle
yes,
of criminal justice.
yes,
The system is so broken that the people who are in charge of implementing the system
yeah.
decided that
We're not interested in following rules, procedures, norms,
extra
laws,
legal,
anything like that. So yeah,
absolutely,
and that is what we have to understand
yeah,
when we talk about the police and the criminal justice system. And just I mean, not directly related on this point, but something that tells us something about the police in India is Ginny Lokanata's new book.
yeah,
How the police plays a role in sort of creating the contingent state that justifies itself to the Indian public. Like this is why we exist. This is what we do. This is our power
yeah.
on an ongoing basis. It's something that offers a very interesting insight, and readers should read her new book, the link of which I think
I'll
I
link
will
it.
give in the
Yeah,
description. And as those are regular listeners to this podcast would know, all the reading material which we mentioned here, we will be providing links to in the description. But
yeah,
yeah, I thought just that's a great point that you sort of
yeah.
highlighted.
No, thank you. I mean, there's other, I mean, one of the things I actually did want to point out is a lot of times when people talk about the efficacy of criminal law, they say, oh, look at the conviction rates. The conviction rates are so low.
Mm.
But when I read Pratiksha Bakshi's Public Secrets of Law, which is a phenomenal book, and she does an ethnographic study of rape trials in India, I actually realized that maybe the low conviction rate is not a bad thing because a number of cases that actually go to conviction, she documents the cases where it's consensual sexual relationships between teenagers,
Right.
somebody who is 16, 17, or 18, where you have all these cases where now with mandatory minimum sentencing and the problem with stringency, which we see after the criminal law, after the Nirbhaya case and the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which essentially increased the severity of punishments, you have situations where what constitutes a statutory rape, because we've raised the age of consent to 18 now, was actually between consenting adults or consenting teenagers who are very close to adulthood. So you have the family which now uses the rape law to control the women or the girls in their families from pursuing consensual relationships, which is also what Shilpa Phadke and other feminist geographers point out in their book Why Loiter, that safety in the city is often very closely tied to the notion of sexual safety, not
Right.
actually safety for the well-being of the woman.
Right.
So when we say sexual safety, it means, because women are supposed to be representatives of honor of the family, of the community, and so sexual violation has a disproportionate value that is attached over, say, physical violence or domestic violence or just cruelty and emotional or psychological violence. So in this regard, it's also closely tied with notions of sexual endogamy in our country, the caste purity of associating with undesirable
Mm.
people, whether it's across religion, across caste, across, I mean, now it also sort of reaches sexuality and other dimensions. But now we have laws in our country. We have states that have passed laws in the name of anti-conversion that are now being used to target young couples who are, yeah, young interreligious couples,
Yeah. And,
which
and and
is,
and I think this is something that the judicial system is also grappling with, because
yeah,
on the one hand, and this is something that, by the way, very interesting story. Apparently, it's not as new as we imagine.
yeah,
When Jinnah married Rati Jinnah, who was Parsi,
yeah,
her father filed a case against Jinnah, accusing him of kidnapping his daughter, or I think it was a civil case, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yeah.
Rati Jinnah had to go to court and say that, yeah, she married him out of her own free will. Things like this have happened, but now they have gone to another level. And I think
Yeah.
Rukmini Srinivasan, in her study of the Bombay and Delhi criminal courts, to follow up on the changes made to the criminal law after the Nirbhaya incident, finds that, well, actually, a lot of these are purely consensual relationships that parents want to find a way to stop, because and even if, and in a lot of instances, even if the parents might be okay or indifferent to it, their immediate society jumps on them to say, how can you not uphold our caste honor, how can you not uphold our community's honor, your daughter is like this, your daughter is that, and sort of pressure them into that act. But be that as it may, it's something that our judicial system is being increasingly called to resolve.
Yeah.
Those of you who might follow the website Live Law may find instances of and the website produces these orders where courts repeatedly grant bail or quash proceedings where they find that it's purely consensual. They call the accused boy, they call the alleged victim woman, and she says, "No, I went with him consensually," and the matter pretty much ends there. And in my experience as an advocate in the Delhi High Court, this was back in 2010, 11, 12, almost every day a case like this was there in Delhi High Court in the criminal jurisdiction. It didn't make
Yeah.
news because perhaps, and as you rightly pointed out, it was not perhaps seen as a large scale sociological phenomenon, but now that maybe there are enough inter-community, inter-caste, inter-religious marriages, that the reaction to it is so strong that, to the point that, as you mentioned, UP has passed that anti-conversion law, and Uttarakhand and Madhya Pradesh have passed such laws, and they're of course in court. But it tells us something as to how the criminal justice system is being used to, in fact, limit women's choices, to
Absolutely.
to exercise greater control over them, and to sort of it is all presented in a very different way, of course. But at the heart of
All.
it, as you point out, and as Pratisha Bakshi this also points out, it's, even if you take out those anti-conversion bills or whatever you want to call it, the system itself has been weaponized by communities and by people to control women's bodies.
Absolutely. And it's all done in the name of women's protection. It's all done in the name of women's safety.
Yes.
So, on one hand, it's like, and the reality is, the country is deeply unsafe for women.
Mm.
The country is deeply unsafe. Like, I mean, I've had to go to the police station in the last 1 year to file a
Yes.
claim for an assault.
Yeah.
I've experienced harassment by a cop in Indiranagar in Bangalore. These are privileged places. You don't
Yeah.
expect these things to happen, but they do happen,
Mm.
which is why I think it also comes to me. There are two, three things that I think I'd like to point out. One is that a lot of the feminist organizations, like, I mean, I'm thinking of Anveshi in a women's counseling center in Kozhikode. It's one of the most respected women's group, and it's been working specifically on violence against women since 1993, which is 28 years. They are firmly opposed to criminal litigation, because
Okay.
what they do is, yeah, they use counseling and compromise as a strategy.
Mm.
And they see that in their cases, in their records, they don't keep track of convictions,
Okay.
they keep track of settled cases.
Okay.
And the reason they do that is because women come to them, and these laws, the criminal laws that we've talked about, often become a bargaining chip, either to get basic maintenance,
Mhm.
to get the dowry back from the family,
Mhm.
to basically becomes a chip in terms of coming to a compromise with the violent husband or the cruel and in-laws. So we already know that criminal law isn't actually serving the purpose it was designed to serve.
Mm.
It's serving a different purpose.
Mm.
It's now letting women just, extricate themselves of violent situations,
Mm.
and maybe just with some level of economic or social security,
Mm.
which I think is where it's important. Right
Right.
now, to me, feminist intervention then should not be in the case of funding the police or investing in a surveillance infrastructure. It should
Mm.
be in investing in communities and empowering women themselves,
Right.
making childcare, socialized and usable,
Mm.
allowing, designing the city in a way where women can freely leave their homes if their husbands or families are violent or abusive towards them. And this is also true for the trans community. In a recent study that was done in India, which you can see in the report, they found that across 60,000 people that they had interviewed, majority of violence perpetrated against the transgender community comes from police officials and law enforcement.
Right.
So you have a community that is that the greatest perpetrator of violence is the police themselves, who are constitutionally charged with protecting people. And the other problem when it comes to gender minorities and sexual minorities in particular is that the much like everybody, like women and girls, family is a site of great violence.
Yes.
The family isn't there to help you, the family isn't protecting you. So there are no other civil social safety nets that people can go to, which is why we need uh, a decarceral methods. We cannot, like carcerality, which is the emphasis on policing, on surveillance, on
Yeah.
punitive punishment,
Yeah.
doesn't work. Re-victimizes and re-traumatizes girls and women and gender and sexual minorities who actually go to them.
Yeah.
Because if you read Pratiksha Bakshi's book, it's a really stark and painful reading.
Mm.
Just read what happens when you walk into a court, or when you
Mm.
actually subject yourself to that process. Because one thing is, nobody, whether it's the police, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the lawyers, whether it's a medical legal community, which is, all of these are male dominated, number one, actually are understand one, the nature and of power dynamics when it comes to sexual or any kind of violence against women. Second, they're not trauma informed. It's almost as if we don't have a trauma informed response in the criminal justice system. We're still arguing for such basic things such as
Mm.
follow procedure, do not, re-victimize the victims, don't engage in rape culture, that we have not yet come to a place where we say that, any survivor of violence needs to have somebody who is sensitive to the nature and understand trauma. And the final thing that then I would like to come to is even the work of feminist scholars on prisons themselves.
Mm.
Angela Davis, who is one of the preeminent feminist scholar, wrote a landmark essay called "Are Prisons Obsolete?"
Mm.
And in this, she talks about both the gendered nature of prisons, as well as says that prisons don't solve crime.
Yeah.
They don't solve crime. And we have, even in India, the CPAP project, which is the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project, that have done research to show how disproportionately prison populations in the country come from lower caste, Adivasi, and Muslim communities.
Right.
So there is, we also see that these kinds of social inequities are replicated. So these marginalized populations are then so simply and easily criminalized,
Yeah.
and they also link it to a colonial hangover of, the Criminal Tribes Act,
Yes.
where certain communities have been targeted,
Mm.
and those historic biases and stereotypes persist till today. And yeah, so I think,
That's a great point. And I think one thing we should sort of clarify for listeners is that when Anveshi says that they prefer settlement, we're not talking about like the Kap Panchayat kind of settlement, right?
absolutely,
We're not talking about essentially doing it in the name of the community or honor or the caste or whatever it is, right? We have to keep in mind that ultimately there are two ways to do this. One is where you center the feelings of the man, the community, and his family, or one where you center the needs of the woman, and not just like
yeah,
the immediate need of the woman, but also her long term safety and security. And I think we have to understand that when Anveshi works towards this, it is centering the woman's need in this process. And
absolutely,
and one thing that I've realized, as a personal this thing in the context of my interaction as a lawyer and somebody who gets asked for a lot of legal advice in this context, uh, it is that we cannot assume that everyone has equal capacity to navigate the criminal justice system. I think that's something that which as you mentioned, Pratiksha Bakshi mentions in her book, and that's even at the stage once they cross the initial threshold of even being part of the system. But
yeah,
for a lot of women, the sight of the system itself is daunting enough.
yeah,
If for those of you who have read Kafka's The Trial, in that famous story within the story where the gatekeeper itself is so terrifying that you don't want to walk in. It's the feeling for a lot of women. It's the feeling for a lot of women, and this is sometimes not even dependent on their background. They just feel that the system itself, whether they are underprivileged or not, they just feel that the system itself from the outside is so hostile, forbidding, time consuming, whatever you want to call it, it's just not worth it. So when women say that we would rather settle this, it perhaps might make sense to create mechanisms like what Anveshi has done, which settles disputes from the point of view of protecting their interests and their rights. And we shouldn't see a settlement as like some unfair outcome, right? Because we have to understand that the criminal justice system is not neutral, it's not equal for everyone, it cannot easily be navigated, and to demand that that is the only right way to arrive at an outcome is perhaps self-defeating in some ways. And a very great point about Angela Davis also. And on that note, I sort of like want to flag some very interesting work that is going on in Rajasthan by the PAR NGO, that is run by Smita Chakrabarti, which sort of advocates for open prisons, right? Which sort of says that incarcerating someone, right, should not necessarily mean you put them behind bars. They can whatever suffer punishment, but that punishment shouldn't get precedence over rehabilitating them into society. So for those of you interested, you can see the kind of fantastic work that PAR has been doing in setting up open prisons across Rajasthan. It's something that other states should really take up, because if the system focuses itself on deterrence, it is going to fail. It is going to fail, and we have seen that it fails. It's obvious to us. So this is an option which sort of says that maybe you, and to the other end, apart from just sort of rehabilitating and protecting the women's rights, if we want to bring about long-term change in the way men view women, in the way communities view women and their rights, maybe we have to find a way of also addressing that part of the equation, right? And
Yeah.
we can't just say, oh, whatever, men will be men, we just throw them in prison and solve the problem. That's not going to address it. um, this could be the way that it might change stuff. So PAR is perhaps something that presents us with an alternative idea of not punishment but reformation, of a
Yeah.
structured reformation, if you want to call it.
No, thank you for saying that. I think you're absolutely right. I think this also requires us to rethink what we mean by justice, right? There seems to be this one, like, I don't understand. Actually, I don't know what justice even means anymore, because
Tell me.
what justice means for different people, like, I think, which is why we need, like, there are so many competing notions of justice, what justice means, and how do we then come together as to, because one, we know that this process is not just.
Right.
The women who actually come to this process are not getting the justice they deserve, because I mean, we've seen Priya Ramani is one of the women who spoke out
Yeah.
during Me Too in India.
Yeah.
2 years later, she's fighting a case against, of criminal defamation.
Yes.
So we see literally every day in the way the system punishes women who do speak up.
Yes.
So I wonder what is justice for Priya Ramani,
Right.
who one is talking about assault, and this is against a man whom 20 other women also spoke up against.
Yes.
How many assaulters do we meet and harassers do we meet who have left such a long line of survivors in their wake? And so it automatically creates a situation. Even Harvey Weinstein,
Yeah.
the number of women who came out, and finally the cases that actually went to trial were one or two counts. So we know that this process doesn't actually offer justice. And secondly, how many men will they lock up? Because when Me Too came out, the number of people who were accused of different kinds of sexual harassment, and I think it's important to also point out, after the Criminal Law Amendment Act, sexual harassment is a cognizable offense in Indian Penal Code.
Yes.
So technically speaking, every time there is a complaint of sexual harassment, the law says that you are actually supposed to notify the police.
Mhm.
But we don't do that often, because and I don't think I wouldn't advise anyone to do that also, because it's not the survivors wishes have to be respected in this matter. But this is then brings me back to this report that was recently submitted by five legal academics in the UK
Mhm.
to the UN Special Rapporteur, who has been collecting information on the efficacy or human rights standards across rape laws in different countries. They argue in the report that criminal law can just never be the site of uh, actually preventing rape or violence against women.
mm,
And they say that what we need are structural changes.
right,
What we need are an understanding of how to change the stereotypes, stigma, and the perceptions that haunt the system at multiple levels. And you need empowerment of women, you need the gender power imbalance in day-to-day life has to be corrected. And I do think that law has a role to play there, which is what, like, in our work in this report, what we try to do is precisely focus on what actually helps women feel safer, what gives them freedom, what gives them mobility and autonomy. Because women's safety is not actually linked to protection, as we've seen repeatedly that the who guards the guards, right? And the people who are charged are often hurting women themselves.
mm,
Is then freedom and autonomy, is then to be given the full range of um, freedoms and rights that are constitutionally guaranteed to every citizen,
mm,
so that women can move freely. And in the urban context, this is why, to me, municipal laws then become an overwhelming site of feminist intervention and engagement.
yeah,
Because if you have a local park and your park is shut during the day because it's run by a resident welfare association, or it's been outsourced by the municipal corporation to a, I don't know, a CSR wing of a company, that is not a space where working women who want to, I don't know, women who live at home want to go for a walk or take their children can actually access. So I would much rather have a focus on who is running your everyday life,
mm,
who is making sure your footpaths are okay or not,
yeah,
street lights are working or not.
yeah,
And ultimately, you know uh, if you actually have transport to be able to step out.
yeah,
And I think in this report, then, like, which is why the argument away from criminal law is, I don't think I have answers in terms of what justice then means.
yeah,
But what I do know as a survivor of violence myself, that to me, I would much rather figure out a way in which law is strengthening my ability to access opportunity and is creating a city that's more equal. Because if my safety is coming at the cost of the demonization of another group in the city,
yeah.
that's actually not safety.
So that is a very valid point that you make, and I think when we sort of you have nicely brought it all together in terms of when we think about women's safety and criminal law, we sort of have to understand that it is not something that you pass the law and something gets safer. It's not as if you strengthen the police and women feel safer. It's not as if if police increase their surveillance, women feel safer. We have to understand that the criminal justice system itself might be turned against women, might focus its might be used to in fact control the movements of women. And even if neither of these happens, if it works quote unquote as perfectly as intended, by simply putting men in prison, you are not addressing the larger question of women's safety. That
Absolutely.
when we think about what are the better ways to that when we sort of say that this is justice, we have to really think many times about what justice means, from whose point of view, for whom, and not just it's not just about two individuals, but also for what is justice in the larger community sense. And
Yeah.
which is where I think this episode sort of what is highlights, and you've done it very well, is to show that we have to turn our focus and our attention on the less obviously women's safety parts of it, and the more subtle aspects to how women's safety is determined on a day-to-day basis, which is municipal laws, which is who has
Absolutely.
control of our public spaces, who is given access to it, and who controls access to it. And maybe the real answer for creating a safe city for everyone lies in how we distribute these powers and functions and use
Absolutely.
them in a manner for the benefit of all women in the city, rather than trying to use the big stick of criminal justice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that, Alok. I think you actually, I just wanted to add one thing because I think it's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah,
Because people have shown that when you invest in education, when you invest in social security, when you actually introduce comprehensive sex education from an intersectional perspective, that actually reduces sexual violence. who is teaching our children what consent means, when like the country that is on one hand so sexually repressed is also the country that has, I don't know, like just look at our media, it's also obsessed with it.
Yeah.
So we have to have, I mean, I think it's important, I think, for all of us as a, like as a society, to be, I don't know, grown-ups about how we think about these really important questions, because the consequences are really dire.
Yeah.
And I think, which is why, what even people who say, oh, if not prisons, if not criminal law, then what?
Yeah.
Invest in healthcare, invest in education, invest in psychosocial learning, teach children and everybody how to deal with their emotions. These are all important facets of human development. And I think today the problems that we see are essentially a complete lack of the state giving up any responsibility in, are we not just producing good workers, but are we producing good human beings, right? And that and we have to situate that in a constitutional framework and constitutional morality, as a right to the city is also a right to education,
Yeah.
is a right to freedom, is a right to, which is what I think I would like to conclude the session with. I will include all the links of all the people that we've touched upon, and so that you can take a look at it. I would particularly recommend reading Sara Ahmed's work, who's also, I didn't get a chance to talk much about, but I will include her essays in the reading list. Thank you so much, Alok, for
Happy.
taking your time. Yeah.
And I hope all of our listeners have come away from this episode having learned a lot more about this.
Yeah.
And do stay tuned in. We'll have more episodes of the Feminist City coming through.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I'm actually extremely excited to say that the next episode is going to be with Dr. Shilpa Phadke, who is the author of Why Loiter. So do tune in. And yeah, thanks a lot for staying with us.